I should have known something was wrong the moment I saw the car parked at the end of my driveway, its engine idling, headlights off, as if someone didn't want to be noticed. It was late, long past the time anyone should have been loitering outside my house, and yet, there it was. I stood at my window, watching, waiting, feeling the uneasy prickle at the back of my neck. A minute passed. Then another. Still, the car didn't move. It wasn't the first strange thing I had noticed since moving here 6 months ago. At first, it had been little things, someone standing too long near my fence, a neighbor's voice dropping to a hush when I walked by, the way people seemed to glance at my house like it was out of place. I had brushed it off as nothing. Maybe I was overthinking, maybe it was just the way small communities worked. But then came the letters. Neatly folded, tucked under my windshield wiper, slipped into my mailbox without postage, as if hand-delivered. At first, I thought they were just neighborhood notices, the usual welcome to the community nonsense. But they weren't. They were warnings. They were rules. Not official ones, not from any government office or city council, but from an entity that referred to itself as the association. The wording was polite, but the message was clear: my property needed to meet community standards. My trash bins needed to be placed a certain way. My porch light was not in harmony with the neighborhood aesthetic. My driveway, my own driveway, was too cluttered, according to them. I ignored them at first. After all, I wasn't part of any HOA. My property sat just outside its official boundaries, something I had confirmed before buying the house. But the letters didn't stop. Instead, they escalated. They started referencing specific details, things no one should have known unless they had been watching. My car had been parked at an angle that disrupts symmetry. My lawn was growing at an inconsistent rate. It was unsettling, but I had dealt with nosy neighbors before. I wasn't about to be intimidated. Then, one afternoon, I came home to find a woman standing at the edge of my driveway, staring at my house with a calculating expression. She was dressed too neatly, too perfectly, in a way that screamed control. She had the kind of posture that people use when they believe they own the ground they stand on. I recognized her immediately, Karen, the HOA president. I had seen her before, leading meetings at the community center, speaking in clipped, authoritative tones. She didn't look away when I stepped out of my truck. Instead, she lingered, gaze sweeping over my yard, my house, my driveway, as if cataloging every imperfection. I felt something shift in the air, something unspoken but heavy with intention. I had the strange, sinking feeling that my presence here was a problem she was planning to solve. That was the day everything changed. That was the day I realized I was being watched. I woke up the next morning to the sound of footsteps outside my house, the faint crunch of gravel on my driveway. My first thought was that it was a delivery driver, maybe a neighbor walking by, but when I glanced out the window, I saw her again. Karen stood near the edge of my property, clipboard in hand, writing something with the kind of deliberate precision that made my stomach twist. She wasn't alone this time. Another woman stood beside her, nodding along as Karen gestured toward my house, my driveway, my yard, as if discussing something that didn't belong to me. I stepped outside, letting the door slam behind me just to make my presence known. Karen barely acknowledged me. The other woman flicked a quick glance my way before looking down at the clipboard, her lips pressing into a thin line. I could feel it in the way they stood, in the way their eyes moved. This wasn't a casual walk, and it certainly wasn't friendly. They were assessing, measuring, planning. By the time I reached the driveway, they were already turning away, but Karen didn't look surprised. She met my eyes with something cold behind hers, something that told me she had already decided how this was going to go. She didn't need my permission, my agreement, only my submission. And I knew, right then and there, that I had no intention of giving her what she wanted. The first official notice arrived that afternoon, tucked neatly into my mailbox. A violation, according to them. My driveway was obstructed, creating an unnecessary disruption to the community aesthetic. The notice didn't cite any actual law or ordinance, only that residents are expected to uphold neighborhood standards in good faith. I almost laughed. My driveway was perfectly fine. The only obstruction was my own truck parked in my own space, exactly where it had always been. I crumpled the notice and tossed it aside, assuming it was just an empty warning, an attempt to make me fall in line. But 2 days later, another one arrived. Then another. Each more aggressive than the last, each worded with more insistence, more authority. And then, on the 5th day, the fine came. A real one, typed out on official HOA letterhead, demanding immediate payment for violating community harmony guidelines. It wasn't a large sum, but that wasn't the point. The point was the audacity, the nerve to try and control something they had no legal claim over. I wasn't part of their HOA. My property wasn't under their jurisdiction. And yet, they were acting as if I had broken some unspoken law, one they had the power to enforce. I knew I had two choices. I could ignore it, let them keep sending notices, pretend it wasn't happening. Or I could push back. The answer was obvious. I had spent my life standing my ground, and I wasn't about to roll over for a group of entitled neighbors who thought they could bully me into submission. So, I did the one thing I knew would make them furious. I parked my truck directly at the entrance of my driveway, blocking it entirely. If they wanted to claim my parking was an issue, I would give them something real to complain about. If they thought they could dictate how I used my own property, I would make it very clear that they had no power over me. It didn't take long for the reaction to come. Less than an hour after I moved my truck, I heard the sharp knock at my door. When I opened it, I wasn't surprised to see Karen standing there, arms crossed, expression unreadable. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. She didn't try to pretend this was a friendly visit. Instead, she handed me another notice, this one printed in bold letters, warning of escalating consequences. I stared at the paper, then back at her, waiting for her to say something, but she didn't. She just stood there, waiting, as if expecting me to crumble, to apologize, to agree. When I didn't, when I simply stepped back and shut the door without a word, I thought for a moment that I had won. But I was wrong. Because the next morning, the cops showed up, the sound of tires crunching against gravel made me look up from my coffee, and I felt a familiar weight settle in my gut as I saw the flashing blue and red lights reflecting off my front window. I set my mug down, exhaling slowly, already knowing who was behind this. It didn't take a genius to figure it out. Karen had escalated. I watched as two officers stepped out of their patrol car, their movements calm but purposeful, like they had done this routine 100 times before. I pushed back my chair, my heartbeat steady, my irritation growing with every second. By the time I reached the front door, they were already scanning the property, eyes drifting to my truck sitting across my driveway, blocking the entrance exactly as I had left it. The taller officer glanced down at a small notepad, flipping through it with a practiced ease, before finally lifting his head and acknowledging me. I stayed silent, waiting. I wasn't going to make this easy for them. I wanted to hear exactly how they were going to justify wasting my time. One of the officers cleared his throat, then got straight to the point. There had been a complaint. A call from a concerned member of the community regarding a parking obstruction. The words were carefully chosen, professional, devoid of any real accusation. But I could read between the lines. Karen had made it sound like an emergency, as if my truck being parked in my own driveway was some kind of public hazard. I let the silence stretch, let the moment drag out just enough for the absurdity of it to sink in. The officers shifted slightly, maybe expecting an argument, maybe hoping for an easy resolution. But I wasn't going to give them the reaction they wanted. Instead, I nodded slowly, letting my eyes flick toward the patrol car, toward the wasted resources being spent on something so ridiculous. Then, I asked the only question that mattered: was I breaking any laws? The officers hesitated. That tiny pause told me everything I needed to know. Of course, I wasn't. This was my property, my land, and my truck was parked legally. There was no ordinance, no rule that said I couldn't block my own driveway, no law that gave the HOA any real power over me. But Karen had called anyway, dragging the police into her personal vendetta, hoping intimidation would do what her useless fines couldn't. One of the officers exhaled, shaking his head slightly, clearly aware that they had been sent on a fool's errand. No, they admitted, I wasn't violating any law. No, they weren't going to force me to move my truck. But, they added, it might be neighborly to consider adjusting it so that it wouldn't cause any more issues. A suggestion, not a command. A weak attempt to smooth things over. I didn't respond. I didn't nod. I didn't promise anything. I just let the words hang there, ignored them, and watched as they exchanged a look before finally deciding they had better things to do. When they left, I stood there for a moment, watching their car disappear down the road, feeling the irritation simmer beneath my skin. I knew Karen wouldn't take this as a loss. She had failed this time, but that wouldn't stop her. She wasn't the type to let go easily. She was testing the limits, probing for weaknesses, seeing how far she could push before I snapped. And I had no doubt she had already planned her next move. I found out what it was the very next morning, when I stepped outside and saw the new letter taped to my front door. This one wasn't just another warning. It was a formal citation from the HOA, stating that I was now being fined daily for non-compliance. The amount was absurd, escalating with each passing day that I refused to move my truck. But what really caught my attention wasn't the fine, it was the closing statement at the bottom of the letter. It warned that if I continued to disregard community guidelines, further action would be taken. No specifics. No details. Just an open-ended threat. A promise that they weren't finished with me yet. I tore the letter off the door, crumpling it in my fist, my pulse steady, my anger sharp. Karen wanted a battle. And I was more than ready to give her one that I didn't move my truck. I didn't respond to the fine. I let the days pass, let the numbers pile up on whatever ridiculous tally the HOA was keeping, and waited to see just how far Karen was willing to take this. I had dealt with people like her before, those who thrived on control, who needed power over others to feel important. She had expected me to cave, to obey, to recognize her authority where none existed. But I wasn't part of her HOA. I wasn't under her jurisdiction. And I wasn't afraid of whatever petty tactics she had left to throw at me. The first sign that she was reaching desperation came 2 days later. I woke up to find a tow truck idling at the end of my driveway, the driver leaning against the door, checking something on a clipboard. He wasn't moving yet, just waiting, like he had been told to hold off until someone gave the order. And I had no doubt who that someone was. I walked outside, slow and deliberate, making sure he saw me before I even spoke. He hesitated, glancing between me and my truck, clearly not wanting trouble. I didn't need to ask what he was doing there. I already knew. Karen had called him, convinced him that she had the authority to have my vehicle removed, that my truck, on my own property, was a violation she had the power to enforce. It took only a few words for him to realize he had been dragged into something he wanted no part of. He checked his paperwork again, muttered something about miscommunication, and left without touching my truck. I stood there, watching him drive off, waiting for Karen to appear, waiting for her next move. But she never came out. She had made the call, but she hadn't been brave enough to show her face when it backfired. That night, I installed more cameras. Motion sensors. Extra lights. If she wanted to play dirty, I wanted proof. Because I had a feeling this wasn't over. And I was right. 3 days later, I woke up to find my truck covered in bright orange stickers, plastered across the windshield, the doors, the back. Violation. Towing notice. Unauthorized vehicle. Each one bearing the HOA logo, each one meant to send a message. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the letter sitting on my doorstep, this time not just a fine, not just another warning, it was an official notification that my property had been deemed inconsistent with community standards, and was now subject to potential legal action. I read the words slowly, letting their meaning sink in, letting the sheer absurdity of it all settle deep in my bones. They were threatening legal action. Over my own property. Over a truck in my own driveway. Over rules that didn't apply to me. It was so ridiculous, so audacious, that for a brief moment, I actually laughed. But then the anger set in. This wasn't just Karen being a nuisance anymore. This was Karen trying to intimidate me, trying to twist the system, trying to make me believe she had power where she had none. And I had had enough. I didn't waste time. I took every letter, every fine, every bogus violation and handed them over to my lawyer. I showed him the security footage, the tow truck incident, the stickers plastered across my truck like some kind of public humiliation attempt. I told him everything, from the first letter to the police visit to the threats of further action. And as I spoke, I could see it in his expression, Karen had crossed a line. And she was about to find out just how big of a mistake that was. The cease and desist letter went out the next morning, delivered directly to Karen and the entire HOA board. It outlined every instance of harassment, every false fine, every overstep of authority they had made. It cited property laws, trespassing laws, defamation laws. It made it very clear that if they continued to target me, they would be facing real legal consequences. And I made sure it wasn't just delivered privately. I posted a copy on the neighborhood forum, on the local social media groups, anywhere and everywhere people would see exactly what was happening. The fallout was immediate. Neighbors started talking. People who had been too afraid to speak out suddenly started sharing their own stories. Karen's grip on the HOA began to slip. Board members who had blindly followed her lead started distancing themselves, denying involvement, trying to save face. And then, just when I thought the drama was winding down, Karen made her final, desperate move. That night, my cameras caught her sneaking onto my property. It was almost pathetic, the way she moved quickly, glancing around, hoping not to be seen. She had a can of spray paint in her hand. She had already started on one side of my truck, barely finishing the first angry streak of paint before the floodlights kicked on and the siren blared through the yard. She froze, caught like a criminal in her own neighborhood, eyes wide as she realized she had been caught. And then, without thinking, she ran. She didn't get far. The cops were there in minutes. And this time, they weren't responding to a bogus complaint. This time, Karen was the one being questioned, the one fumbling for excuses, the one who couldn't explain why she had trespassed onto private property in the middle of the night with a can of paint in her hand. The charges were minor, trespassing, vandalism, but the damage to her reputation was irreversible. The HOA held an emergency meeting the next day, and by the end of it, Karen was no longer president. She resigned before they could vote her out. And just like that, the reign of control she had built over the neighborhood crumbled. I never paid a single fine. Never moved my truck. Never gave in to a single one of her demands. And when it was all over, when the letters stopped, when the threats disappeared, when the neighborhood finally breathed a sigh of relief, I did the one thing I had been waiting to do since the day I realized I was being watched. I parked my truck exactly where it had always been. And this time, no one said a word.